I guess I'll just get started with who I am and why I'm doing this. My name is Derek Appel. I also go on the internet as Derp or Derpsburg. I do historical gaming videos on YouTube, as well as all kind of like general content with gaming and history and all that. And those are my two biggest passions in life: history and video games. And it's a unique blend because historical games can give us the opportunity to live in a world that's not possible for us now. We can live in time periods and interact in them in a way that no one could have really foreseen in any of our times. So these kind of games I take more notice to than usual because what they're showing and what they're representing is the stories of people who basically paved the way for us to be in this room talking about a video game. Now, whenever you think about the word history, what does that mean? What do you think of when you hear that word? Some of you might think of the subject in school. You might think like black and white photographs, maybe like a timeline of dates that just had like a brief sentence or two about what happened. Maybe your grandparents, sometimes, in some cases, those people are literally people who lived in a different world. But history is so much more than that. History is one gigantic story, and it's the story of us. It is the story of how we got to where we are today, and only to go forward and only to know what we do when we go forward, we have to look back and see where we come from. And video games give us a very unique way of doing that. Now, when you think of historical video games, I'm very confident, please bear with me. Now, when you think of historical games, you think of the general big kind of AAA titles like Call of Duty, Battlefield, Medal of Honor is one. These kind of just really bombastic cinematic experiences that offer very, very tight, very, very entertaining single-player modes, as well as offering a very good gameplay to give you something nice for multiplayer. But if you notice here, it's all about the Second World War. Now, the reason that is because the Second World War is one of the few wars in history, in our history, that has a good guy versus bad guy narrative. Fascism and imperialism had to be stopped in Germany, Italy, and Japan. I don't think there is any form of argument that you can make against that. If you are the person who would, I very highly question your moral character. But that makes it good to play in a video game. Because when you're playing a video game, you want to be the hero. You want to be the person who solves the problem, who saves the day, who gets all the glory, who clears out that nest of Germans in an MG-42 bunker. And also the way American culture celebrates the Second World War, it feeds into that too. The Second World War was the biggest event in human history, bar none. But the only reason it happened is because there was a first. The First World War created the world we live in today. That is not an exaggeration. Many things that define the 20th century are because of events that transpired in the First World War. Events today even are still being affected by the First World War. Without the First World War, we don't see a Second World War, as I previously mentioned. Without the First World War, we don't see the rise of extremist political ideologies like fascism and communism, and the results of those two ideologies being put to the forefront in the political stage. Without the First World War, you don't see a Soviet Union. Without a Soviet Union, you don't see a Cold War. Without the First World War, we don't see the Middle East as what we see it today. One of ISIS's main goals was to abolish the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was the treaty that created what the modern Middle East is today after carving up the Ottoman Empire. And we'll actually go into a little bit into that in just a moment. This war is super important to learn about how we got here today in terms of political means and in terms of society. This war also affected Western society and society as a whole on a tremendous and almost traumatic scale. You know, many literary historians will look at this war and point at that affecting pretty much everything being written in the 20s and 30s. J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote the Lord of the Rings, served as an infantryman in the British Army. He fought in places like the Somme and Passchendaele. And if you ever read Lord of the Rings and you read about his descriptions of Mordor, it sounds very, very similar to what those battlefields were described as. Now, in such an event that's so important like this, why is it not covered that much? Now, there's a couple reasons for this. One is the First World War is associated with a thing called trench warfare. This, we'll kind of go into detail of how this happened later, but it is defined by stagnation, stalemate, and pointless slaughter for years. Now, some people will make the argument that the Second World War was worse because it was much bigger and involved much more people. And that is true. But the Second World War was a mobile war. Not a lot of times in that war you had units fighting that stayed in one spot for more than a week or a month at a time, except for maybe cases in the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Soviets. In this war, people stay in one spot for years. And when you have a war zone with the modern means of weapons that are introduced in this war, it creates hell. And that's what we're going to be talking about, because we have an example of a AAA game that tries to show this and tries to represent it to a mainstream audience. And that's Battlefield 1. Now, at this point, I am going to be walking because, oh, never mind. Never mind. It's okay. We're gonna, oh. I don't want to ruin your set.
Yeah, somebody will before the week's over.
You know what? Never mind. I'm just gonna move down. You can tell I planned this very well. But enter stage left, Battlefield 1. Now, this game got a lot of flack when it first was being put out and introduced and when the first trailer came out, because with the way this war was fought on the ground, you can't really give a good, like, casual experience for, you know, your typical mainstream, I don't like the word gamer, but I can't figure any other, like, synonym. You know, it's showing what this war is like to those kind of people, you know. People who play like Madden or Call of Duty, you know, that kind of demographic. So it's an interesting take, and when DICE was going about interviews and previewing this game to media, they kept bringing up that what they wanted to do in this game is show sides of the war that no one really knows about. Now, the war is not typically well taught here in the U.S. because we weren't in the war that long. We were super important in the long run and in honestly preventing that war from going on any further. And I'll argue with any European who says otherwise. But we fought as an entire army, as our own little army, for about 7 or 8 months, compared to countries like Britain and France and Germany, who fought this war for years. And this war has a bigger meaning to people who live in those countries as well, because just because of the scale and the conditions and what those battles affected in terms of those, like, national consciousness for those people. You know, you'll see cases where there are villages in Britain whose entire male population disappears in a day because the way the British tried recruiting more men was to entice people who went to pubs together, you know, your pub mates. If you all enlisted together, you'd be in the same unit. And that sounded fun, because in the 19th century, war is seen as a good thing. War is seen as a very romantic and it's a very good thing. Dying for your country was seen as a very good thing. Nowadays, not so much. And part of the reason we see it that way is because of this war. Now, before we get into how the game represents the war, we have to talk about the war itself. This war was one of the most horrible and horrific events in history. That is not an exaggeration, bar none. So many people died in this, millions of people. More people would die in the Second World War, but the conditions of this made this worse. You know, it would have a total 40 million casualties, an estimated people die of, 15, 19 million people died, over 23 million people were wounded. Casualties is more of a blanket term, meaning deaths, wounded, and missing. A lot of times the missing would just get lumped into the dead, because an artillery shell can certainly make you disappear. Now, on the bottom it says it was fought for no good reason. Now, when I say this, I don't mean that the war didn't have to happen or there was no reason it was fought. This war had to happen at some point because of the way European politics was set up. If it didn't happen here, it was either going to happen at some point in the next year or the year after that, or maybe 10 years from now. It would have happened because of the behavior of the people who were running these empires were going about. Now, to be able to talk about this game single player and to be able to give you guys an idea of what DICE tried to represent, we have to go through the war itself, and we have to talk about how it starts, and also give a little narrative as to how it went. Now, this subject is incredibly dense, incredibly complex, and incredibly huge. Like the Second World War, you can study certain topics about this war for decades and still not get to the bottom of the barrel. So I have to condense this in about 5-10 minutes at most so we can go on about our panel. For this, I am borrowing a little map from a YouTube channel called The Great War. If you guys, yep, one of the best YouTube channels ever, and I'm so sad that it's basically over because the war is 100 years old at this point, and we passed its end last year. So, but if you ever wanted to go deeper into the subject, that is a fantastic place to start. It is very easy to watch. It's very entertaining to watch. I cannot highly recommend it. The Great War on YouTube. Now, Europe before 1914 is a very, very complex series of alliances and agreements. And also, it's a nest of multiculturalism and rising nationalism. Nationalism is going to be a very, very, very key part in why this war starts and why it explains these people who are in power, their line of thinking in terms of policy. Now, at this point in 1914, where our story starts, there's a lot of trouble going on in the Balkans. If you notice, just below Austria-Hungary, if you can see, there's a little country called Serbia. Now, Serbia just had its independence from the Ottoman Empire, which is the big old blob who is kind of like the general, like the main. I never really read about the Ottoman Empire. I don't know if they were they were multicultural. I don't know if they were essentially Muslim, but they are the dominant region in the Middle East. Now, the Serbs are incredibly proud, incredibly patriotic people, more so than us, I'd say. The Serbs are fucking crazy. That's one way of putting it. Now, Austria-Hungary, in a few years before, recently acquired a territory known as Bosnia-Herzegovina. I think that's how it's called. If I butcher any names as well, I am going to apologize up front. I am an American. I speak American. I am not fluent in the more culturally I guess, classier languages like French and, you know, all that, so I apologize. The Serbs don't like this because the Serbs increasingly want a nation for Slavs, for the Slavic peoples, or especially for Serbs, and they see Bosnia as something that was stolen from them almost. And the Austrians don't care because the Austrians are an old empire. They've been around since after Napoleon did his thing in Europe. And they are an empire that are made of 15 different, there are 15 different languages to their national anthem. They're not just Austrians and Hungarians, there are Czechs, Slovenes, Poles, Ruthenians, Italians, you know, other Slavic peoples. The list goes on, and it's an incredibly diverse culture, and it kind of leads to their downfall. But there are people in Serbia who do not want Austria around in Bosnia. So in July of 1914, I do not remember the correct date, but the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, gets shot and killed in Sarajevo. It was Sarajevo, my apologies. By a man named Gavrilo Princip, who was a young Serbian nationalist, part of a group called the Black Hand. Now, many historians debate whether or not this assassination was funded by Serbian intelligence, and you can make arguments that suggest that it was. The Austrians certainly thought so. And this kind of kicks off a powder keg that's been sitting around for decades. We mentioned before Europe has a very unique and very complex system of alliances. And Austria responding to this event towards Serbia is like a domino effect. Because Serbia has a friend, a very big friend, very big friend, and that of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire sees itself as the guardian of the Slavic peoples, and they see this as something that they need to deal with. And you can't really blame Austria for the way they go about this, because if we had our vice president assassinated in a foreign country that may or may not have been funded by that foreign country's intelligence agency, we would probably be doing the same exact thing the Austrians are doing right now. They essentially, well, I don't think that we would go so much to this extreme, because Austria basically goes to Serbia and says, you are handing your country over to us, essentially, as of this moment. We are investigating this murder, we are taking this investigation over, you have no say in this matter, anything we say goes, your sovereignty is gone. Serbia says, no, fuck you. So they go to war. Russia says, hey, stop, because no. and Austria says, no, we are justified in this, and Russia goes, okay, fuck you. And so they start mobilizing. Now, with the way mobilizations work with early 20th century armies, they might as well be 19th century at this point with the way these guys are built and equipped and how they think in terms of training and doctrine. Mobilization is something that cannot stop, and once it starts, other countries have to start it too, or else they get behind, and if the war ends up coming to them, they're at a disadvantage. So Austria has a friend. Their friend is the German Empire. The German Empire at this point is one of the strongest empires in Europe. It's a relatively young country, only about 40 to 50 years old as of 1870. And they're one of the most powerful industrial nations in that region. They're one of the biggest, most well-trained armies in the region. And they're not something to be trifled with. Germany can very easily, with Austria, defeat Russia. That is no argument with that. With the way the Russians were built and all that and how they did things, it wouldn't have worked out. But Russia has another friend, and that friend is on the other side of Germany's border, France. The Germans and the French hate each other more than any peoples in Europe that I can think of. They've already fought a war previously in which the Germans outright humiliated them, and the French are very salty about this. So Germany goes to France because they know that the French are friends with the Russians, and they go, what are your intentions? And the French say, well, we're going to honor our agreements. And the Germans say, okay, well, give us all the forts that are along your border, the most fortified region in the world at this time. Give us every single one of them in the Keys. We'll occupy them, and we won't do anything else, and we'll take this as a sign of good faith. France goes, no, fuck you. And so the Germans go, okay, no, fuck you, and they go to war. Now, like I said, this region is the most fortified area in Europe. It is a death sentence to send any army across it. Now, the Germans are a very smart, very advanced, well, I hesitate to say smart because of events that happened after this war, but they have been planning for this war for decades. And they have a plan to try and fight France and Russia at the same time, because they cannot fight a two-front war. They will learn this again in the Second World War. They can't do it. So they have a plan, and it's an incredibly risky gamble. What they're going to do is they're going to send most of their army not across the border. They'll have something there to hold them. But what they're going to do is send a gigantic force of 750,000 to 1.1 million men through tiny Belgium. Because the Belgian-French border there's nothing there. It's undefended. So there's nothing stopping the Germans from sweeping into Paris and then trapping the French army along that border. It sounds like a great plan on paper. It's called the Schlieffen Plan. It does not work out in practice because there's a small problem. Belgium has a small friend, and that friend is Great Britain. Great Britain is one of the most powerful empires at this point, has the most dominant navy, and their army, while it is very, very small, and to the point where the Kaiser joked that if the British land on German shores, I'll have the police arrest them. They were not considered to be a very serious threat to the continental armies. But these men are highly trained, probably the best trained soldiers in the world at this point. These men have fought in places like the Boer War, and the way the British Reserve System worked at that time. These men are highly trained marksmen. They can put out 10 rounds a minute very accurately, almost to the point of machine gun fire, and they are not to be trifled with. Now, Britain has a treaty with the Belgians to guarantee their independence. Germany, ironically, has the same thing, except they throw this notion away and call it, it's famously called by a German diplomat as just a scrap of paper. And they kind of naively think that the British aren't going to do anything about this because it's just a piece of paper. And at this time, Britain's in a very bad spot in its history here. They're almost to the point of civil war over Ireland. Ireland and the North Ireland question has always been a very touchy subject with Britons and Irish, and this is one of those big times. After this war, we'll see the Irish Civil War, but this war kind of puts a stop to that because the British people now see the Germans moving through Belgium, and the Germans kind of just haphazardly committing war crimes everywhere and not really expecting the world to, care. They have this weird, naive, childlike sense of like, oh, they're not going to care about this, and it's a very horrible thing that they're talking about. It's crazy. But the British basically go and say, get out of Belgium, or we're going to war. And Germany says, listen, this would be a really stupid thing for you guys to do. It's just Belgium. It's just ignore it. It's just Belgium. Who cares? Who cares? It's just a scrap of paper. And Britain just says, no, fuck you, and they go to war. Now, the war at this point is it's a great, gigantic exercise of years and years of military thinking and theory and how things are going to work. Things like machine guns and planes and artillery and barbed wire. We'll start seeing things like poison gas later on in this war, airplanes and tanks. The things we associate with modern warfare today start here. And it's this war is a gigantic just timeline of people realizing that a century of knowledge and thinking and theory is piss in the wind, because none of it matters, because nobody expected the kind of violence, the kind of slaughter, the kind of tragedy that we see in these next 4 years. The first month of the war is a terrible example of this. There is a point in that fight where the French lose 30,000 men dead in a day. Dan Carlin makes a point in his Hardcore History series about this. Napoleon, 100 years ago, would brag to the Austrian diplomat, "You can't stop me. I spend 30,000 men a month." And that was considered to be something incredible. They just lose that in a day here. What do you think how this is going to play out? Now, the war is defined by trench warfare. Nothing can survive in an open field in Europe where there's machine guns and artillery and all this massive amounts of industrial death. You know, it's horrible. So trench warfare becomes the norm. And we don't start seeing the war changing that way until the last year, where we start seeing what is basically prototype World War II armies. We see tanks, we see half-tracks, we see armored cars, we see men fighting in what looks like modern infantry tactics today. You know, this war condenses a lot of human knowledge in a short span of time, in a very violent span of time. Now, how is DICE going to represent this? Well, they went about this in an interesting way. If I can find the cursor for this. They have war stories. Now, war stories is their single-player mode, and what it is 6 different stories for 6 different characters. Each character is in a different part of this war. For the most part, this takes place in the late war years because with the way Battlefield plays, if it was just trench warfare and the static, you know, the monotony and the and you know, I can't really think of another word for it, just the stagnation of it, it wouldn't make for a very fun video game, unfortunately. So they have, and to their credit, they do pick moments and areas of the war that not a lot of people know about, and credit to them, because those people and their stories matter just as much as those who fought in the trenches in the Western Front. This war involved a great many peoples from all over the world. This was, in fact, a world war. And again, to their credit, they do a good job of showing how the scope of this war really was, in terms of actually telling these people's stories and what they went through and what their experiences were. That's a whole nother thing entirely. It very much seems like with the amount of material that's there, you can't not use any of it. And it almost seems lazy. Now, video game development is an incredibly complex process. I understand this. And I also understand that DICE is basically a tentacle of EA, and EA is a giant corporation whose only interest is making money. It is a business, that's what they do. I understand that, and I understand that you can't necessarily have your touching 100% historical accurate story all the time. You know, things get cut. You can't necessarily do the things you want in a certain amount of time because you have to push a product out. I understand that. But the way DICE talks this game up and the way their product ends up being, it's almost like they couldn't give a shit. So, where does this mode start with? Well, the game starts in this nice intro sequence where you are thrown into this generic fight in the Western Front about 1918. So the war is mobile at this point, and you don't play as one person. You are not expected to survive. So once you're done, you kind of move on to another guy on the field, and it's meant to show you how your chances of survival were when you're in these areas, because it's not. You know, people like to think that, you know, going into a war, you know, if you never experience the violence and the terribleness of it, you think, oh, I'm going to be just fine. Not so much, not especially in this war. And it's meant to show you just the tragedy of it, and it kind of does a good job of it. But the thing that annoyed me is that the game's character is a Harlem Hellfighter who is not shown, well, he is shown in 2 cutscenes, and he is not brought up ever again. He has no dialogue, he has no name, And he is just, it's almost an afterthought, especially considering he's on the cover of the game. This, I'm not a fan of that, because the story of the Harlem Hellfighters is an incredible one. These men were a African-American regiment. They were normally a National Guard regiment from New York. And they were rebranded as the 369th Infantry Regiment. Now, the period we are talking about in history, like it or not, is one of the most racist periods in our history. We are talking about a period where we were living in the era of Jim Crow. We are talking about a period of history where the colonization of Africa is near its zenith. We are talking about a period of history where it is an accepted science that the white race is the superior race, and its job is to uplift everybody else in cultural enlightenment. That was an accepted science at the time. This is the history, and it colors everything that happens in what we see with these countries. It actually also affects countries in their policy making. You know, before this war, Russia and Japan will fight a war, and the Russians will disregard the Japanese as, quote, you know, I use this term in a historical educational sense, yellow monkeys. They did not regard them as their equals. They got their ass kicked by the Japanese, horribly. The Japanese would essentially sink almost the entire Russian Navy, and they would humiliate them. And the reason it happens this way is because that racism affects policymaking. Racism is, unfortunately, a very important topic to touch on, and especially with the Harlem Hellfighters. African-American troops, especially in the United States Army, are a very new thing at this point. Beforehand, we would see things like the Buffalo Soldiers in the West and the Spanish-American War, and the Army and Navy are the only one. The Navy accepts, we're accepting African Americans for things like cooks and cleaning and, you know, menial tasks. The Army is the only branch of service that is accepting African Americans into combat service. Now, they don't train these guys at all because the Army doesn't have a system in place about segregation or integration or anything like that. So, unfortunately, it kind of falls into what was generally accepted thinking at the time, which was horrible, disgusting racism. These men would not be trained at all when they're sent to Europe. They would not be expected to fight. They would be expected to just dig latrines, dig ditches, in some cases not being paid for it. And these men, these people, when you're looking at these people and you look at what the times they're living in, you can't help but think, well, why the hell are these guys signing up to fight in this war, to fight in this army, to fight for a country that, without a lack of a better, you know, explanation, hates them? And a lot of, you know, I don't like talking in blanket terms about a group of people because it's very assumptuous. Stephen Ambrose does this all the time, and I hate his work because of it. You know, many people join the Army for very different reasons. Nowadays, it's a very good way to get to college. If you're, you know, it'll give you some sense of discipline, or, you know, if you need like something in life. And it's the same thing here too. You know, also, you know, adventure, glory, seeing the world. But a lot of people, a lot of African Americans who fought in this regiment joined because they wanted to prove that they were just as willing to die for their country as white men were. It's very interesting because a lot of these people are still very patriotic Americans, despite the fact that those in power do everything they can to keep these people down. And it's an incredible testament to how strong these people are. They're willing to sign up and give their life in a terrible, terrible war to just prove to people we bleed the same blood you do, and we deserve better. And these guys certainly did deserve better, because the Army did not treat these guys well at all. The Army would not let these guys fight. And it got to the point, and the reason was white officers refused to fight alongside, black African Americans. With the enlisted men, it was kind of a mixed bag because with lower class people, you kind of varied, beliefs and everything. But with officers being, kind of, I hesitate to say aristocrats, but they're people who have money. They refuse to let it happen. So what Pershing, General John Pershing does, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, what he does, he gives these guys to the French. Because the French, who have colonies in Africa, have African regiments. And the line of thinking the Americans had was, well, these guys know what they're doing with these people, so we'll just give them to them and they can deal with them. The Americans will circulate a document known as sickbat to the French. I think the abbreviation's Concerns in Commanding Black American Troops. I could be wrong on that, but it's something to that effect. This document is one of the most disgusting, racist pieces of literature you could ever read. It's on Google Books if you dare to look at it. I hesitate to go into detail about this document, but one of the things that this document goes into detail is telling the French not to praise African American troops too highly, because if you did, that would give them the wrong impression coming home that they're worth more or that their sense of being a person is higher of that of a white American. This is real. And the French, keep in mind, the French are an European empire. They participate in the colonization of Africa. They're not innocent on the whole racism thing. Their way of going about it is a little subtle than it. But they look at this document and they go, "Oh God!" and they burn every copy. Like how bad is it that a European power who participates in colonization looks at you and goes, "Jesus Christ, dude, calm the fuck down." Like, dude, like, why? And it's just, it's horrible. Now, these men they'd be treated well by the French. Many times these guys would get, taken by random army guys to do menial work and not get paid for it. But these guys fought for the French, essentially. They were given French equipment, French helmets, French rifles, and they fought with the French kind of near where the Americans were. Now, these guys would hold about 20% of the American front, more than any American regiment in the war. They would also serve for the longest term on the front than any other American regiment in the war. They also suffered the highest casualty rate as well. These men fought just as hard as any other American unit did. These men were heroes. In every definition of that word, they are heroes. And they would not be recognized by our army at all. Henry Johnson, a famous Harlem Hellfighter, would not get his Medal of Honor until President Obama was elected president in 2008. Go figure. But the French was another thing entirely. The French would award these guys 170 Croix de Guerre, which is their equivalent of the Medal of Honor. It's their highest military award for valor and heroism. 170 of these. These things are not given very lightly. These things are not a Purple Heart. Like if you get, shot or a gun goes off next to you, you get a medal. This is not given out lightly. And Henry Johnson is an example of this. He got his, eventually he would get his Medal of Honor for his actions during a patrol on the front. Him and a buddy basically happened upon a German attack of about 30 to 40 guys. And it's only just the two of them. And his buddy goes down during the fight, and his rifle eventually fouls up, so he can't use it anymore. So eventually, he starts using his bayonet, he starts using his rifle like a club, and he uses his traditional bolo knife. And he holds his own. The Germans try to capture him, and he's fighting them off and killing them off one by one, and they can't get past this guy. This 30 to 40 man attack cannot get past this one man. And eventually it gets to the point where the rest of Johnson's unit gets word that the attack is happening, and they start coming up to assist, and the Germans retreat. This man is a hero, and he would not get the recognition from his country until much later, and I think that is incredibly, incredibly unfair. He would, in fact, go on after the war to go on a speaking tour in the United States, and the United States government would ask him very, very politely, please don't talk about how African Americans and white Americans were treating them in the army and how things. Just don't really talk about that. Just talk about your exploits. And Johnson ignored it. Johnson would go into much heavy detail on race relations in the army. You can make the argument that he is one of our first civil rights leaders. Many people associate the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and that's where it started. Not necessarily. You could look at the end of the war here and point the origins of that movement here, because that aforementioned reason of African Americans wanting to serve to prove that they're just as much humans as white men are, as white people are, and it starts taking a hold. Oh, God damn it! Go on. There we go. And one of my examples is this piece of art here. I saw this when I was doing research on this, and when you look at art from this time period and the years preceding that, from like the late 1800s to the early 1900s, when you look at art that depicts African Americans and depicts other races, it is very, 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 very offensive in our modern sensibilities today. They're very stereotypical. They're very hurtful in some cases. This is kind of stuff you would see at the Museum of Intolerance. Not necessarily here. These men are being depicted just as valiantly and just as heroically as any other piece of propaganda that you would see at that time. Now, this is propaganda. I'm not saying that this is some great, incredible, piece of patriotic artwork or anything like that. This is meant to be propaganda. This is meant to entice people to serve and fight for their country and all that. But the fact that just the idea that these people are being shown as people, as radical of an idea as that sounds today, it's a start. And how this war goes and how society starts thinking and developing after the events and after these people start coming home, after the experiences they've been through, people start thinking differently. If a white American soldier sees a Harlem Hellfighter fight like hell, quite literally, your line of thinking that you were brought up with starts being brought up into question, not just on race, but on many different things. Women would start getting, women's rights movements would start getting more and more traction after this war is over, because women would take over places in factories and do jobs that society considered was not for women. It was just, men could only do those jobs. And this war wholeheartedly proves that wrong. There's a reason that the 20s are called the Roaring 20s. It's a very interesting period of world history in that of what could have been. And it's, this war upends societal stuff like racism and sexism to a very shattering degrees. But unfortunately, the game does not represent any of this at all. And this is such an immense topic. It's such a dense, amazing story of material, and none of this is shown here. And if DICE wants to go about and say, we want to tell stories that people don't know about this war. We want to tell stories about the people who fought in this war. But you don't do that. You opt to do this as the experience is one thing. The level, the chapter itself is perfectly fine in a sense of it plays fine. But in terms of telling a story of what happened, it doesn't do that at all. And it flies into the face of what they're explaining this, how they're explaining this game to be. And it sucks. So no, it doesn't. It doesn't represent this at all. And I hate it. Because these men deserve their war movie. These men deserve to be represented in media just as much as the 101st Airborne does in World War II, or any number of Civil War regiments, or anybody. These men deserve it, and we don't see that enough in media. And I hope that one day that changes, because they deserve that spotlight. As horrible and as weird as glorification in war is in American media, it's, you know, it's deserved. I don't think there's a bad, I don't think that's a bad argument. But we're moving on, and now we start getting into the meat of the war. Technologically speaking, this is the war where we start seeing tanks and airplanes and things that we associate with as core parts of modern war today starts here. Aviation will start taking off here as less of a novelty and more of an important service for people. You know, airlines start popping up after the war, and air travel starts being more and more of a common thing. Tanks are also going to be a very, very important thing, because as these armies fight in these battles and realize you can't charge across an open battlefield in the face of heavy machine gun fire and artillery fire. So you have to find ways to circumvent that. How do you beat that? How do you get around this problem? Tanks are one solution to this. These would actually be called tanks because they were kept hush-hush secretly by the British, and they were known on documents and paperwork as like a water tank for bringing up. I think it was like either like, some say it was something for the Navy, some say it was just a water tank to bring up to the front, like a personal, like a carrier or something like that. And these things are basically tractors, because this is a very new thing. No one knows what a tank is like we do now. So this is all like new, almost space age kind of territory in terms of technological advancement. They would stick tons and tons of guns on these things, almost kind of like a castle almost. Like having, you look at a side of a Mark IV British tank, you can't help but think that the casemate looks like something off the side of a battleship or something off of a fort. It's that 19th century style of thinking that starts affecting, you know, going into the 20th century. Not just with everything else, but in terms of technological advancement. These things, though, sucked. They were not as good or as powerful or as amazing as we look at tanks nowadays. These guys were slow. The fastest of them would only go up to 4 miles per hour. That's the speed of a walking man, like, or a walking person. Like, it's not, it's, you know, and that's just the fastest of them. Everything else just moves at a glacial pace. Now, to people who've never seen these things before, it's terrifying. You can't shoot them with a rifle or, you know, some cases you might get it out with a little small field gun, like a small cannon, but these things are terrifying because you can't do anything about it, and they're just slowly coming up to you, and they can kill you, but you cannot kill it. So it has that effect on people, but people and soldiers start realizing that because they're so slow, you can kind of deal with it if you go about it correctly. You can ambush them and throw grenades into the hatches, or you can try and lead it into like a shell hole and get it stuck, and then kill or capture the crew inside as they try to bail out. These things also broke down so much. You know, we're talking about engineers trying to have like tractors that would be put on farms, carrying tons and tons of armor, guns, ammunition, crews of about almost 17 to 20 people, depending on the tank. And tanks are not spacious. They're not roomy. They're very, very crowded, very, very claustrophobic. And they don't have any light in them. And you have a gigantic engine that is loud as fuck in a small contained metal area. It is so loud. It is very loud, and you're in a very dark area with fumes and oil. You're essentially in a room with a car engine with 20 different people. Imagine how that smells. Imagine how that would hear. Or it's not like in this game, in this chapter, they show these characters, and it's a British tank crew, and it's going about the end of the war. And it's kind of like Fury, if you ever saw that movie with Brad Pitt. It's kind of like the British Fury. And I actually like how the narrative goes, because it's interesting. But there's cutscenes where they're in the tank talking to one another, and it's very well lit. There's no noise, and they're able to hold conversations with one another. this would not have happened. You could not hold a conversation at all with anybody because 1, you cannot see them, 2, you cannot hear them, 3, all you hear is a gigantic engine noise. You can't hear anything else. So how people would communicate is by kicking each other in the shoulder, like if you would want the driver to change direction, you kick him in the right shoulder to go right, the left to go left. Like, yeah, imagine going about your day as a tank driver, getting kicked in the fucking back all day. Fuck that. Yeah, that sucks. Fighting in these things sucked, and especially when your tank broke down or your tank got knocked out and you had to get the fuck out of there, and everybody in the world is shooting at you trying to make sure you don't. It's how tanks evolve and how tanks go about is very much a steep learning curve for these people. Like this is a Mark IV tank, and you can see it just looks like the whole tank is just 2 gigantic fucking treads. And that's it. It's nothing. You see there's guns on it and all that, but that's it. We start seeing tanks that we would associate with modern tanks nowadays with a turret that could rotate and everything, with the French Renaults and everything like that. So people start figuring out how to do this correctly. And the Germans never, ironically enough, we associate tanks and armored attacks and all this stuff with the Germans because of World War II, because they kind of pioneered that into modern military thinking. The Germans in this war don't care about tanks. They see them as a novelty. They don't see them as a necessity of making sure that you can fight a 20th century war. And they don't, this is their only tank, and this is the tank that has like 20 people in it, and they don't have a lot of these, and they don't really care about them. So in the game, when you're fighting a whole bunch of German tanks, it's a little questionable. The chapter itself, it does a good enough job of kind of just showing the challenges of what a tank crew would go on. When I did this panel at Mag Labs, I made the claim that they wouldn't necessarily have this tank out behind enemy lines like they do here. There have been, in my research, I've found a couple cases where tanks did get isolated out of an attack, and they were behind enemy lines and would have to either make this weird trek to somehow get back home, or would eventually just get captured anyways. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that these guys could go out and be on this weird odyssey. As a first-person shooter level, it's pretty good. It's very solid, has a neat story, has solid characters. One fun thing I noticed in it, though, is that there's a segment in it where the tank breaks down, and they're trying to get it back started again, and a German squad comes over and starts attacking the tank. So they start crawling over it, they start trying to open the hatches. The crew starts shooting out of the hatches and trying to keep them off, which, by the way, if you shoot a gun... Actually, first off, let me ask this question. How many of those in here have shot a firearm before? Okay, a lot of you. So all of you know, firearms are fucking loud. Very loud. So if you shoot one in a metal box, you're not having your hearing. No. So, and they sent out this carrier pigeon out of the tank to try and tell the artillery back in friendly lines to call a fire mission on their tank to get these Germans off. This would not have happened because carrier pigeons were because we're talking about an era where radio is starting to become a thing. It's mostly telephones and couriers. Communication is still in its infancy in terms of what we think of it in modern times. But one way of going about it was carrier pigeons. You would tape a note with whatever information you wanted to send on the pigeon's leg, send it out, and hopefully it would find its little nest or home or whether I have never really delved too deeply into it. It's very fascinating. But the time it would take for a pigeon to get anywhere near that, the crew would either have been killed or captured. So it's kind of silly. And it's a nice moment. You play as the pigeon, actually. You fly over the way back, the places you just fought, you fly over it, and there's this very nice somber music, and it's a neat moment. But realistically, those guys would have been killed or captured, and the tank would have been captured by the Germans. So it's kind of silly. But the game does not represent what it was actually like to be in a tank, unfortunately. It's a very unique experience, and Now, in terms of playing a video game, I don't think it would be very much of a fun experience. Being in a dark room, just having a loud droning noise in your ear all the time, and there's a small chance that you'll see a large explosion, and that's it. That's the last thing you see. So, does this chapter accurately portray what tank combat was like in World War I? No. Now, there is another innovation of modern technology that is shown, like we just mentioned, planes. Aviation like we said, it becomes a very big part of the world after this war. Before this, it's kind of seen as a novelty, to the point where pilots in the United States Army, who are technically airplane pilots, were trained by the Wright brothers themselves. And the planes of that period, in 1914 when the war starts, look like machines that those guys made. It's not until we go deeper into the war that we start seeing what we associate biplanes. These machines were incredibly dangerous. Now in the game elects to do this kind of weird, kind of roguish, Han Solo kind of character who is making up this story as he goes along about his service in the British Air Force. And in a narrative sense, it's interesting because at the end of it, you're kind of presented with the question, like, is what he's describing really true? Like, is it really, like, did things turn out this way, or is he just embellishing things, or is he just a scoundrel, or just an asshole who's just making his way out? But in terms of showing what aviation was like, it doesn't really do a good job. Aviation and fighter pilots, being a fighter pilot in the war, it was incredibly dangerous in its own unique ways. Being on the front in the trenches is very dangerous, but in its own ways. In this, it's different. We like to think, in this game, when you shoot down a plane, whether it's single player or multiplayer, it goes off in this big explosion like every other cinematic Hollywood movie. It would never be that way. Besides the instruments and the controls, everything in the plane was made out of canvas and wood. Now, I don't know if you guys know this, and I know I just asked you the question of, have you ever fired a firearm before? But I'm going to put out this incredible notion to you. Bullets are made out of metal. Metal beats canvas, I'm pretty sure, and I think it beats wood too. So you might survive a pass if a guy shoots at you in the air. If you get shot down, there is a very small chance of you surviving. Now, the game inaccurately portrays these pilots getting parachutes. Parachutes were a thing in this war, and in fact, they were a thing past the experimental stage. A lot of people think they were just experiments, but they really existed past that. The problem was they were given to balloon crews. That's another thing that this aviation part of this story shows, is that we have Zeppelins, and basically just giant long cigar blimps that could drop bombs. They were basically like the 19th century equivalent of spaceships almost. Like you see this long, gigantic cigar-looking spaceship dropping bombs over your village in Britain. It's fucking scary. So, but those parachutes were given to those crews because for some reason that made sense. And this is an example of 19th century thinking clashing with 20th century reality, and that these countries thought that if you gave a fighter pilot a parachute, at first sign at the enemy, at first contact, when he starts fighting a German or a British or a French plane, he's just going to ditch his plane. Like when the shots are first fired, he's just going to say, no, fuck this, and just bail out. I don't blame them, but it was a means of preventing cowardice. And let me rephrase this. They are directly refusing to give a life-saving piece of equipment to their people because it's a sign of cowardice. That is a very, very, very 19th century means of thinking. And we live in a time where it is a good thing to die for your country, and you should die for your country because it's the biggest thing you could do for your country. And people, I guess in a sense, let that start warping their view of saving lives, and it's a very fucked up case study of humanity. But these things were important also because what they gave armies at the time was the means of looking at where armies were coming from the air, from reconnaissance point of view. Now, beforehand, you just had cavalry, but you're still looking at things from a ground point of view. When you're in a balloon or an airplane, that's another thing entirely. You can just look down. So that's a very basic and a very simple thing, but it's very, very important as to add to the new things that are affecting how the war is being fought and how war would be fought from then on. And here, this is an example of a Zeppelin. Like I said, very long cigar shape. You actually fight these in the war, and actually there were many, many cases where the Germans would send these guys over across to Britain to bomb, to basically spread, to terrorize the population, and to make sure that bringing the war to Britain would have the effect of the people wanting the war to end. It had the opposite effect, and there were cases where fighters and Zeppelins did fight. That did happen, and it's very hard because normal bullets wouldn't have the effect of taking down a Zeppelin. It wouldn't be until somewhere in the middle of the war they would develop an incendiary bullet that would be specifically for lighting the gas in that Zeppelin on fire, which is a horrible way to die, and I would not wish that on anyone. And yeah, like I said, these guys were wood and canvas. These guys were flimsy. If we had one in here, I could tip it over on its side. I could, the idea of tipping a fucking fighter plane over is funny to me. But unfortunately, it does not really represent how this was and how it was for people fighting for it, because it was very traumatic for fighter pilots. Like, you would go up and with your buddies, and you might not ever see them again. They could either disappear, or you could see them just go down, but you don't have the closure of seeing what happens to them or if they got away. It adds to the trauma. It adds to the mental wounds that many of these people are taking home with them. And that's important to the story. And it doesn't show that. It elects to be a tropey war story kind of thing, which, again, it's a AAA video game. It's a piece of media. It makes sense. But there's the material that you could do something to do something interesting. So, no, it does not. Now, as we're moving on, we are going into new territory here, because we are going to Italy. Italy was a very important part of this war, and it's an important part, and it's not one of the more well-known parts. Mostly because Italy joined the war for purely territorial reasons. When the war starts going on, these European powers start looking for additional friends, because they're losing people at an astonishing rate. These battles like the Somme and Verdun are, millions of people are becoming casualties. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying in these terrible, terrible battles. And so they start looking at different countries and trying to sway them into helping them out. Italy is one of them. Italy actually technically was in an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Central Powers. They elect not to honor that agreement because Austria-Hungary holds a couple of territories that have Italian-speaking minorities in it, and Trento and Trieste. And these two names are very important for Italian politics at that time, especially for Italian nationalist movements. That is a whole different topic, and it is a very interesting topic, and I will try not to go into it too much because then we'll miss everything else. It's when we talk about the battles of the war as well, things like the Somme and Verdun, these are held in Europe's vast plains and fields. This part of the war takes place in the Alps, on mountains, valleys, places where there is no such thing as dirt. Everything is rock. Now, this also clashes with how Italians and how that 19th century means of thinking when it comes to service for your country and how you fight wars. It affects that too, and it makes the casualties worse. When an artillery shell hits a field, or like a plot of soil or something like that, Obviously, there's a big explosion, and there's shrapnel, and just death and destruction and explosion. There's a big explosion and all that. But the ground takes some of it. The ground takes some of the impact, and you know, the explosive force goes downward as well as upwards, and you know, that's how a crater is formed. When an artillery shell hits a rock face or a mountain or anywhere in this region, it is solid rock. There is much more resistance to that energy. So it makes the explosion 10 times worse because it's shattered rock, which adds to the shrapnel. And because the region has the acoustics of a box of rocks, so sound bounces off everywhere too. Like we mentioned, guns are loud, especially if there are hundreds of thousands of them going off at once in a small area, especially with big field guns and artillery pieces going off that are 10 times, 20 times just as louder. This is hell. This is a unique form of hell. And it is a miracle that any of these people who fought in this war, both Italian and Austrian and any nationality in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire that fought here, survived. And it is a testament to just what humans can do in extreme situations that enable them to keep going, both physically in a survival sense and both mentally, I guess, as well as a survival sense too. There are many times in this war, both here and in other places, where you can get out very much unharmed yourself physically, but good God, you're going to be a mess because you've seen many, many of your friends killed for seemingly no good reason. And it affects, like we mentioned again and again, it affects these people coming home. Now, the game does not do a good job at all of showing this. You are given, the story of this is a grandfather telling, a father or grandfather telling their daughter or granddaughter a story about the war, about them finding his brother in the last offenses of Italy during the Vito Venerio, I think. I don't know Italian, I'm so sorry. But it's a very tropey kind of thing because also it adds a very video game trope in that it's a level where it gives you a power trip. You are given a big giant suit of armor and a big hulking heavy machine gun to carry around, which you would not see at all in this war, ever, ever, ever. And you are running up 90-degree rock faces at a sprint in this heavy suit of armor, carrying a heavy machine gun, just gunning down dudes. That did not happen at all. The game mentions that you are an Arditi. Now, the Arditi are a real thing. They were a real unit that the Italians had during the war, and these units are not unique to the Italians because the French have them, the Germans have them. The Germans, this will probably be a term that is more recognizable for you, stormtroopers. The German Stoßtruppen would pioneer how you would fight in a war, in a modern war, in terms of being just a boots-on-the-ground infantryman. How we fight wars today is directly from this. And other countries had the same exact idea. The Italians more so. They would have tons of these Arditi units, but they would not be hulking brutes with giant suits of armor carrying machine guns. Armor was a thing in the war, but it was not issued generally well. And the Arditi were very, very fanatical, very, very patriotic. They would be expected to die to the last man, and they did so multiple times. Things like nationalism with Italian peoples, especially in this war, added more to those casualty lists, added more to just the pointless slaughter because of this fervor of just giving your life for Viva l'Italia, and it's tragic. You know, people did not need to die so much in this particular part of the war. For example, and this will show you how crazy this area was, there were 12 battles of the Isonzo. Now, when we look at wars and battles, there's usually one or two battles at most for certain places. There were 12 of these. Every single one of them ended in Italian defeat. The Italians kept trying to attack this region over and over and over and over again, and every single time, hundreds of thousands of Italians would die outright. And somebody thought it was a good idea to keep this going because the next time would work. Surely the next time would work. It didn't work this time because the men didn't have the fire in them. They weren't hard enough. They weren't brave enough. You know, the Italians would bring back decimation during this period. If you do not know what decimation is a method of discipline in the Roman army that involved killing 1 of every 10th man. Imagine if the United States Army did that now. There would be fucking riots. Because what the fuck? Like, why would, that is a very, very fucked up, very backwards thinking means of discipline. And they brought this back because those in power blamed the people who are throwing themselves onto a mountain face in front of machine gun fire and every means of death that you could think of willingly. Period, again and again, over and over again, repeatedly. By the 12th battle of this, the Germans who have finally come to help the Austrians out, because the Austrians are super incompetent, they make a half-hearted attack on the Italians like, this is just, we'll just do this and see what happens. The Italians retreat 50 miles. They almost lose the war. And then, props to the Italians, they do in fact turn themselves around and retake that territory. You know, they start actually start going about things of being a modern army. But it took them long enough. It took them 3 years. And it was 3 years of just pointlessness, of just, at a point, it just starts becoming unexplainable. Because, especially with our modern sensibilities and the way we look at wars nowadays, we think of wars as a means of something that has to happen for very good reason, to stop an evil, to stop something from happening. Fighting for territorial reasons of just acquiring, you know, territory is a very backwards thing for us nowadays. And we think of it now like that because of stuff like the Isonzo, because people kept sending others to their deaths for no fucking good reason. Generations of people will die during this war. You know, many historians will call this the lost generation, and because many things happen afterwards that you can't help but think, like the rise of Nazism in Germany and the rise of fascism in Italy, and how things turn out on the political stage. You can't help but think if these same people were still around, maybe things might have turned out a little differently. And it's horrible. You know, fighting in a mountain like this willy-nilly is hell, and we need to tell the stories of these people who survived, because if we don't, it's a disservice to what they've been through. And also, if we don't learn about these events and what happens, we can't prevent that from happening again. It's very important. The game does not go into this at all. So, no, it doesn't. It just doesn't. The Dice's claim of how they want to tell stories of what the war was like and how these people survived it, it just keeps falling flat on its face. And again, it's another. They do it again here in the next chapter, which is Gallipoli. Gallipoli is okay. A little bit of a shot in the dark here, but is anybody here from the good country of Australia or New Zealand? No one? Okay, that's fine. Gallipoli is very, very important for Australian history, New Zealander history, because when this war starts going and when these countries start thinking this war isn't going to go anywhere, they start looking at other places around the world to try and do something else, to try and maybe put the odds more in their favor. And that was with these group of people called Easterners. And they wanted the war to go into different parts of the world because it wasn't going to happen on the Western Front in Europe because nothing is happening. Any attack just ends up in just wholesale slaughter. So Winston Churchill, who would be famous as Prime Minister in the Second World War, actually comes up with the idea that the newly joined Ottoman Empire, who joined on the side of the Germans, that the British and the Allies should try and knock these guys out as quickly as possible, because where the Ottomans are, it includes Turkey, which includes Istanbul, which includes the Bosphorus into the Black Sea, which is important because that's Russia's only warm water port that is anywhere close to the Atlantic Ocean. Anything else is in the Arctic, and it's very hard to get supplies to the Russians because they're doing terribly. It's very hard to do it on a one-sea lane into the Arctic. So this tries to become a gamble to try and knock the Ottomans out of the war and also to help Russia out. It does not go this way because the plan initially just involves the British and the French throwing all these old battleships through the straits, and that's it. They just do it that way. But then they quickly figure out you can't take this strait and you can't clear it out without sending troops on the ground and clearing out the heights and clearing out the peninsulas. And this is where Gallipoli comes in. Gallipoli is an amphibious invasion, and it is very much like D-Day in the Second World War, except nowhere near as successful and nowhere near as glorified or remembered fondly of. This campaign lasts 10 months. Many, many, many Australians and New Zealanders will die. And not just them, too. We associate this battle with Australia and New Zealand, but there were many other peoples in the Allied side as well. Indians, Canadians. The first North Americans who would fight in the war were Newfoundlanders who would fight here, oddly enough. Indian troops, French colonial troops, and not just on the Allied side, but on the Turkish side as well. The Ottomans were a multicultural empire as well. So they had Turks, Arabs, Armenians. They even had a few Germans there as well. So it was a gigantic melting pot of cultures fighting each other. Now, if you look at this region, this is a bad place to send an army through, because everything surrounding the beach where you're sending troops in is on a hill or is on a ridge. So anybody on there can look down and shoot to their heart's content. Many people will die because they pick these really bad spots and think, well, we just need to keep going, you know, and it's terrible. But also, this is an example of how people fighting this war start realizing that their enemy is not as terrible as their country is making them out to be. You know, propaganda is a very important part of this war, and representing how, you know, the evil Hun is bayoneting babies in Belgium, and how the Ottoman is a cannibal man rapist and shit like that. But when the fighting continues through this battle, there's a point, I don't remember exactly where, but there's a point in the fight where there's the firing stops, and the Ottomans send over a flag of truce to be like, we need to bury the bodies. Because at this point, the decay is so bad that people are getting sick and dying from it. You know, leaving these bodies out in the sun in summer, it's terrible. So the Allies agree. So both sides go up and start burying their dead. And at this point, when you read accounts from these people who went through this, they mention that they notice their opponents and think, these guys are just as in this shit as I am. These guys are suffering just as much as I am. They're in the same exact situation. And it starts leading into people being discontent about war itself. We keep mentioning that these people bring their experiences home, and that affecting society going forward. And, you know, having what your country is telling you what the enemy is, and you experience it yourself in reality, that affects you. And this picture is certainly an example of it. This is an Australian soldier giving a wounded Ottoman some water. And while that's certainly just a basic human decency thing to do, it speaks volumes for what these people were being trained to do and what these people were being told. And again, this is a much better example of what I mentioned earlier. Everything is on a goddamn hill, and they can just keep shooting. It's a turkey shoot, and the Allies just kept going. The main head honcho of the British military, Field Marshal Kitchener, would be told that this campaign needs to end, and he goes, "I don't believe you. It's fine." And so he goes there himself and he goes, "Jesus Christ, okay, all right, yeah, let's get the fuck out of here." The game doesn't go into any of this at all. The game just goes into like this weird war movie thing of an old veteran having this new guy tag along, and he sacrifices himself. It's very bad. It's stupid, and no, it just does not. It does not go into anything like that. It's just a weird tropey war movie thing. I'm also kind of running out of time, so I'm going to be kind of going through this kind of quickly. The last part, we are at the last chapter though, and the last part involves the Middle East. The Middle East is very important in World War I because the Middle East as we know it today, how it's divided and how its countries in it that exist, is because of the First World War, because after the war, the British and the French carve up the region without any regard to national or cultural identities. That is why we have so much of the problems that we have today of all these tribal and cultural differences leading to violence and warfare. It's because of that, and that's because the British and the French were more concerned about securing oil reserves. Oil starts becoming a very important thing in this war, and these powers start realizing that this is going to be a very important thing for the 20th century, and we need to get a hold of it as much as we can. So that affects decision-making in this war. And one of the main figures in the story is Lawrence of Arabia, who was an archaeologist. Now, I can't really go much into detail about him. There's not a lot about him that is known for sure. He's kind of a hard guy to pin down, but he loved the Arabs. He absolutely adored these people. And in a time where people are thinking that the white race is superior as scientific fact, his attitude towards the Arabs of being that we should learn from these people and they're an amazing people flies into that face. And so he's a very unique character. He helps the Arab Revolt, which is funded by the British military to try and destabilize the Ottoman Empire. And it works to an extent. It's a sideshow of a sideshow, as Lawrence would call it. It did not affect anything in the long run. In the game, you are playing as a Bedouin woman with his group, and you go about this like open world kind of area, sabotaging an Ottoman military train. It's a decent gaming mission, but it doesn't go into any of the problems that happens with the Middle East. Lawrence would actually be very, very upset with how the British handled everything in the Middle East, to the point where he would be surprised with being summoned to the King of England for a knighthood, which was a very big deal back then. Nowadays it's kind of but it was a very big deal back then, and he refused. He was the first ever person to refuse a knighthood, solely because he was so disgusted by the way the British handled all these promises to all these different tribes, and they broke most of them because they were more interested in winning the war and getting control of as much oil as they could without as little collateral as possible. And it ends up being a lot of collateral damage in the long run. A lot of his stuff is he's famous for how his writing style is. So his exploits are very well known because of that. But a lot of people doubt the authenticity of them. He's kind of, like I said, he's a hard guy to pin down when you read about him, almost to the point where it's almost on purpose because he doesn't want you to figure out what kind of a person he really is. But yeah, and this is kind of just an example of what that kind of war was fought. It was a guerrilla war, so it was a war on horseback, but with the added addition of machine guns and tanks and all that. So it has this, it has this kind of. It's very important to understand how countries like Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Lebanon or even Israel, the idea of Israel actually starts during this war, but it started for the wrong reasons. Many people in different countries in Europe want a nation state for the Jewish people because they want to take the Jews out of their country and send them somewhere else, because anti-Semitism was certainly a very big thing. And also another explanation, which is very funny, I always laugh at it. It's there was these certain set of people who thought, well, maybe the Jews probably don't control everything, but on the off chance that they do, wouldn't it be pragmatic to be in favor of a Jewish homeland just in case, so we can be on their good side? That was a real line of thinking back then, and I laugh every time I read about it because it's stupid. But yeah, the game doesn't go into any of the issues that is brought up when this war is fought in the Middle East, and it's tragic because to understand and to go forward in the future of one day maybe that region will find peace, because God knows those people deserve it after the hells that they've been through, especially in Iraq recently with ISIS and everything like that. Those people, I think, should deserve the chance of peace and being able to live their lives and, go about living, just living. Such a crazy idea, right? But no, the game does not focus on this at all. Now, again, like a MagLabs panel, I will not have enough time to go through what I plan on doing. I wanted to tell actual war stories that actually kind of portray how the war is. But I only have time for one. And to me, it's the most important one because it is hard for us as people living in these times to really relate to people who lived like a century ago. A lot of times because the way they speak English is different, so for us it's strange to read and understand. But reading this letter that is written by oh shoot, I hit the wrong one. This letter that's read by I think it's a Charles May. Yeah, Captain Charles May. He is a captain in the British Army, and he is writing a letter to his pregnant wife back home. And this is before the Battle of the Somme, one of the biggest battles in British history, and also one of the most tragic. You know, nearly 20,000 British soldiers would die on the first day, which is terrible. And you read this letter, and while you can't really relate to these people, you know, normally, you know, thinking of it at first, you read this letter, I can't help but choke every time I read it because I can't help but put myself in this guy's shoes and what would be going on in my head if I was writing a letter like this. And this letter goes as follows. Quote, I must not allow myself to dwell on the personal. There is no room for it here, and also it is demoralizing, but I do not want to die. Not that I mind for myself. If it be that I am to go, I am ready. But the thought that I may never see you or our darling baby again turns my bowels to water. I cannot think of it with even the semblance of equanimity. My one consolation is the happiness that has been ours. Also, my conscience is clear that I have always tried to make life a joy to you. I know at least that if I go, you will not want. That is something. But it is the thought that we may be cut off from one another, which is so terrible. And that our babe might grow up without my knowing her, and without her knowing me. It is difficult to face, and I know your life without me would be a dull blank. Yet you must never let it become wholly so, for to you will be left the greatest charge in all the world, the upbringing of our baby. God bless that child, she is the hope of life to me. My darling, au revoir. It may be well that you will only have to read these lines as ones of passing interest. On the other hand, they may well be my last message to you. If they are, know, though, all your life that I have loved you and child with all my heart and soul, and that you two sweet things were just all the world to me. I pray God I may do my duty, for I know, whatever that may entail, you would not have it otherwise. Captain Charles May, 22nd Battalion, Manchester Regiment, 91st Brigade, 7th Division. The very next day of this letter being written, the Battle of the Somme would start, and Captain Charles May would indeed be killed. He would leave behind his wife, who I cannot for the life of me forget her name, and a baby daughter. When you read about this war, and when you read about the people who lived through it, it is very easy to start becoming numb mentally when you start reading about the immensity of the casualties and the lists of dead. There's a quote attributed to Joseph Stalin, who, you see this quote in Call of Duty death screens all the time. And this quote is, one death is tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. And it is very hard when you're reading these battles to not start thinking about these names and the immensity of it as just one giant statistic. You have to remember that that's not the case. These are 1,000,000 Charles Mays. These are millions of people who had families, loved ones, aspirations, dreams, people like you and me. And they never came home, and the people who were in their lives lost something. And they lost it for no good reason. Something like this must never, ever happen again. Never. Because this is how we wipe ourselves out. This is how we die. This is how we end the story that is humanity. This is how we end history. It's easy to think nowadays that something like this could never happen again because we bring up arguments like the world's much more connected now, it's much smaller, communication is everywhere, you know, the world's much closer, economies are so linked together, it would be foolish. People before this war said those same exact arguments, and it happened anyway. We must never forget that we are very capable of fucking ourselves up, and it's very scary. And the only thing we can do to go forward and to make sure that we don't get another Charles May ever is to learn from our mistakes, to take what we see in media, like video games, when they show historical events and periods and trying to tell these stories. It is important that we learn and that we actually learn from them. There is a saying amongst historians, and it's a very tired saying, and it's, you know, you roll your eyes whenever you say it or hear it because it is said so fucking often. History is doomed, it's something to the effect of, history is doomed to repeat itself for those who do not learn it. It's something to that effect. It's something that we hear all the time. Again, you'll roll your eyes if you hear it. It is so, so true. And one way we can learn from it is through games. And games offer us that means of having us interact in that world and having us live in it in a way that we could never, any other person in any other period of history could dream of. So it's important that we take these lessons and we actually learn, because this war was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was not. And I think that if more and more people start learning from history and learning what's behind the cinematic curtain that is games like Battlefield and Call of Duty, that we can start going forward, and that maybe one day, God help knows, that we can live in a time where there is an end to all wars. That's a very high-minded idea. I don't think it'll ever happen, but it's a very nice thing to go about. It's a very nice thing to start trying to grasp. Well, it looks like we're 2 minutes over. Thank you guys so much for coming by. I am truly humbled that you all stuck around for me for this hour and a half of your precious MAGFest time. I certainly appreciate it. Yeah, thank you for stopping by. Again, my name is, you can call me Derp. It's a silly name, but that's how I go as, and I do historical gaming content on YouTube. I have much more projects coming that are going to be in the same vein as this, but in a more controlled, kind of edited kind of method. So I hope if you enjoyed this panel, you'll stick around and check out my exploits later. Thank you guys so much. I hope you all have a wonderful MAGFest. If I see you on the floor, I'll be more than happy to come up and say hi. And if you have any questions, just be more than happy to ask me. I love talking about this stuff. I love talking about history, and I love talking about games, and I love talking about it with people. So thank you guys so much. I hope you all enjoy. Have a good MAGFest.